World orders do not collapse in a single moment. They collapse when leaders begin to say publicly what everyone already knows privately. This is the story of three speeches, spoken almost 20 years apart, by three very different leaders. Yet together, they tell a single story, the end of the rules-based international order. Part 1. Munich 2007 Putin. The system is hypocritical. In 2007, at the Munich Security Conference, Vladimir Putin does something unexpected. He drops the diplomatic language. He says the format allows him to avoid pleasant but empty diplomatic terms and to speak plainly about international security. And then he delivers the core claim. The unipolar world that emerged after the Cold War, he argues, is not stability. It is domination. One center of authority, one center of force, one center of decision-making, one master. Putin says such a system is not only unacceptable, but impossible, not because the dominant power lacks resources, but because the model itself is flawed. It has no moral foundation. Then he moves from theory to consequences. Unilateral actions, often illegitimate, have not solved conflicts. They have created new tragedies and new centers of tension. He describes what he calls an almost uncontained hyperuse of force, military force that plunges the world into permanent conflict. But the most important part comes next. Putin says this destroys legal predictability. International law, he argues, is no longer a stone wall protecting everyone. It is applied selectively, increasingly resembling the legal system of a single state. And when law stops protecting everyone, no one feels safe. Arms races return. Deterrence erodes. Countries seek insurance, including weapons of mass destruction. Putin then names the alternative. The use of force, he insists, can only be legitimate when sanctioned by the United Nations. NATO and the EU cannot substitute for the UN. And then he touches the real trigger. NATO expansion, missile defense, the balance of power. If one side believes it can neutralize the other's deterrent, its hands will be free, not only in local conflicts, but eventually in global ones. Russia, he says, will respond asymmetrically, not out of aggression, but because deterrence is mathematics, not emotion. And he ends with a sentence that defines Moscow's self-image. Russia has used, for 1,000 years, the privilege of an independent foreign policy, and it will not abandon it now. Munich 2007 is not a declaration of war. It is a declaration of illegitimacy. The challenger is saying, the rules are selective, law is instrumentalized, and power is unrestrained. And then, a decade later, the second shock comes from the other side of the Atlantic. Part 2, United Nations 2018. Trump, the system is a bad deal. In 2018, Donald Trump speaks to the United Nations General Assembly. If Putin attacked the system as hypocritical, Trump attacks it as unprofitable. He opens with confidence, jobs, markets, military strength. But quickly, the speech becomes doctrine. Trump's core claim is simple. The world should be a collection of sovereign nations, not a system of global governance. He says the United States chooses independence and cooperation over control and domination. Sovereignty first, institutions second. This is not just rhetoric. Trump openly rejects globalism and embraces patriotism as a governing principle. Then comes the economic pivot. For decades, he says, the United States opened its market with few conditions. Others did not reciprocate. They dumped products, subsidized industries, manipulated currencies, and exploited access. The result, he claims, was a massive trade deficit and industrial hollowing out. And the central target is clear. China's integration into the World Trade Organization. Trump accuses certain states of state planning, forced technology transfer, and intellectual property theft, while America played by the rules. His conclusion is blunt. The United States will no longer accept a rules-based trading system that works against it. Tariffs are imposed. Trade is weaponized. Economic openness becomes conditional. This is the moment the hegemon stops presenting itself as the neutral guardian of the system. Then Trump moves to institutions. The United States withdraws from the UN Human Rights Council. He rejects the International Criminal Court as illegitimate and unaccountable. America, he says, will never surrender its sovereignty to unelected global bureaucracies. This is not isolationism. It is selective engagement. Rules will apply when they serve national interest. They will be ignored when they do not. Energy dependence is framed as coercion. Migration compacts are rejected. Borders are reasserted. Strategically, this speech signals something new. If Munich 2007 was the challenger saying the rules are a weapon, UN 2018 is the hegemon replying. Then we will weaponize them too, openly. And then comes Davos. Not from a challenger, not from a hegemon, but from a middle power. Part 3, Davos 2026 Carney. We lived in a fiction in 2026 at Davos. Mark Carney does something rare. He names the moment. Not a transition, a rupture. The end of a pleasant fiction and the beginning of a harsh reality. A world where integration has become coercion and power operates with fewer constraints. But Carney's speech is not cynical. It is moral and analytical. To explain why the system endured, he turns to Václav Havel. In The Power of the Powerless, Havel describes a shopkeeper who places a sign in his window. Workers of the world, unite. No one believes it. Everyone performs it. And because everyone performs the lie, the system survives. Havel called this living within a lie. Carney applies this logic to the international order. For decades, middle powers prospered under what they called the rules-based system. They joined institutions. They praised principles. They benefited from predictability. They also knew the truth, that the strongest exempted themselves. That trade rules were asymmetrical. That international law applied differently, depending on who was accused and who was harmed. But the fiction was useful. American hegemony provided public goods. Open sea lanes, financial stability, collective security. So the sign stayed in the window. That bargain no longer works. Integration has become a weapon. Tariffs, finance, supply chains, tools of pressure. When rules no longer protect you, you protect yourself. Energy, food, critical minerals, supply chains. But Carney is clear-eyed. A world of fortresses will be poorer, more fragile, and less sustainable. If great powers abandon even the pretense of rules, transactional gains will shrink. Hegemons cannot endlessly monetize their relationships. Sovereignty, once grounded in rules, will be grounded in the ability to withstand pressure. This is risk management, and risk can be shared. Collective resilience is cheaper than isolated fortresses. So the question for middle powers is not whether to adapt. They must. The question is how. Build higher walls. Or build something new. Carney calls this value-based realism. Principled, but pragmatic. Engaging the world as it is, not the world we wish existed. Coalitions, not illusions. Issue by issue. Partner by partner. Because when middle powers are not at the table, they are on the menu. To live the truth means naming reality. Stop pretending the old order still functions as advertised. Apply standards consistently. Build what you claim to believe in. The old order is not coming back. Nostalgia is not a strategy. From the fracture, something stronger may emerge, but only if we stop pretending. Free speeches, free truths. Putin said, the rules are selective. Trump said, the rules are a bad deal. Carney said, the rules were a fiction we agreed to perform. The rules-based order did not collapse in war. It collapsed in honesty. The question now is not who broke it. The question is who knows how to live after it. The three speeches, Munich 2007, the UN in 2018, and Davos 2026, are not isolated political statements. They are strategic interventions that mark successive stages in the erosion of the post-Cold War rules-based international order. Read together, they form a coherent narrative of delegitimization, renationalization, and post-illusion adaptation. What kind of speeches these really are? Munich 2007, Putin, a speech of delegitimization. Putin's Munich address is often remembered as confrontational, but its deeper function is juridical and normative. It challenges the legitimacy of the unipolar order, not merely its outcomes. The central claim is that international law has become selective and instrumentalized, no longer a constraint on power, but a tool of it. By arguing that legal norms increasingly resemble the domestic law of a single state, Putin reframes unipolarity as a structural injustice, not a temporary imbalance. The speech performs a crucial move. It declares that Russia no longer recognizes the moral authority of the system that emerged after 1991. This is not yet revisionism by force, it is revisionism by normative withdrawal. In effect, Munich 2007 announces the rules are no longer binding because they are no longer universal. UN 2018 Trump. A speech of recontracting Trump's UN address operates on a different axis. Where Putin attacks legitimacy, Trump attacks profitability. The rules based order is no longer presented as unjust, but as a bad deal for the United States. Trump reframes global governance as a set of transactions in which the U.S. assumed disproportionate costs, while others exploited openness without reciprocity. This marks a shift from order to deal making. Institutions, WTO, ICC, UN bodies, are not rejected in principle, but conditioned on immediate national interest. Sovereignty becomes the trump card that overrides institutional constraint. Strategically, this is the moment when the hegemon stops acting as the system's neutral guarantor and begins acting as a selective enforcer. Trade, sanctions, tariffs, and legal institutions become instruments of leverage rather than pillars of order. Trump's speech does not dismantle the system, it unbundles it. Davos 2026, Carney. A speech of demystification. Carney's Davos speech is fundamentally different. It is neither confrontational nor transactional. It is diagnostic. By invoking Václav Havel's concept of living within a lie, Carney introduces a radical idea. The rules-based order endured not because it was consistently true, but because everyone behaved as if it were. This is a devastating admission. It suggests that middle powers maintain the system through ritualized conformity, tolerating inconsistencies because the fiction delivered stability and prosperity. Carney's intervention is not anti-liberal, it is post-naive. He argues that integration has become coercive and that invoking rules without the capacity to enforce or withstand pressure is self-deception. This is the moment when the system is no longer attacked or renegotiated, but psychologically abandoned. 2. Three diagnoses of the same order. Together, the speeches form a triadic diagnosis. Putin. The order is illegitimate. Trump. The order is unprofitable. Carney. The order was performative. This progression matters. Orders collapse not when they are violated, but when challengers reject their legitimacy, hegemon stops subsidizing them, and beneficiaries admit the illusion. 3. The quiet shift from law to power. Across all three speeches, international law undergoes a transformation. For Putin, law has become a facade for dominance. For Trump, law is optional, valid only when aligned with sovereignty. For Carney, law remains valuable, but only as a political project supported by capacity, resilience, and coalition. The implication is stark. Law without power becomes rhetoric, and power without law becomes instability. For Geoeconomics as the new battleground. A critical continuity links all three speeches, the weaponization of economic interdependence. Putin anticipates it, warning that force and security architecture are inseparable from economic dominance. Trump operationalizes it through tariffs, sanctions, and trade renegotiation. Carney theorizes it, describing integration itself as a source of vulnerability. What begins as suspicion becomes practice, and then doctrine. 5. Who each speech is really addressing. Each speech has a visible audience, and a real one. Putin speaks to Russian elites and disaffected states. Russia will return as an autonomous pole. Trump speaks to American voters and industry. The U.S. will no longer underwrite the system at its own expense. Carney speaks to middle powers and global managers. Stop pretending, adapt, or become irrelevant. 6. The three stages of collapse. The collapse of the rules-based order unfolds in stages. Delegitimization. The rules are unjust. Renationalization. The rules are conditional. Post-illusion adaptation. The rules no longer describe reality. This is not chaos. It is systemic reconfiguration. 7. The deeper paradox. Each speaker exposes a contradiction. Putin invokes universal law while embracing asymmetric deterrence. Trump rejects globalism while exercising global leverage. Carney condemns fiction while proposing new, smaller rule systems. These are not hypocrisies. They are symptoms of a world transitioning from universalism to functional pluralism. Final insight. The rules-based international order did not collapse in war. It collapsed when challengers withdrew moral consent, hegemons withdrew unconditional support, and middle powers stopped believing the story. What replaces it will not be another universal order, but a patchwork of power, rules, and coalitions, less elegant, more fragile, and more honest. This channel is not about opinions. It's about structure, power, and consequences. Subscribe if you want to understand the world as it is.